Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the second episode of the Forensic Fingerprint. On today's episode, we will shortly reflect on module number 3. It is called Doing Science, and for this module, there was an interesting experiment we did. On a 1-liter bottle, we made 3 small holes. Each of them had a spacing of 6 centimeters between them, and then I covered all 3 holes with a strip of tape. Then I filled the bottle with water, and the experiment was based on developing a hypothesis on what would happen after ripping the tape off each individual hole. My hypothesis on what would happen was partially right, as my predictions included the change in flow after each individual hole was exposed. The experiment was also repeated with the cap off as well, and it did produce different results. Observations on the flow of each hole with and without the cap showed that the intensity of the stream was dictated by the volume of water over each hole and the ratio of air and water displacement inside the bottle. In today's episode, we're also going to be looking over at some news. And looking over at today's news, we have seemed to found advancement in the collection and transportation and processing of DNA from fired cartridge casings. So, from spent bullets. A comprehensive study published in 2022 showed that the new recovery method, approximately 67% of fired casings recovered at crime scenes, produced unusable DNA. Another older study done in 2015 by the San Diego Police Department used a less effective processive method, which showed a success rate of 30%. Early attempts at recovering DNA from fired cartridge casings yielded limited success. However, recent studies and technological advancements have dramatically improved the potential for obtaining usable DNA profiles from this challenging evidence type by using enhanced extraction and amplification methods. Advancements in DNA extraction kits and amplification methods have increased sensitivity, allowing for the detection and analysis of smaller quantities of DNA. Some labs have implemented and modified protocols specifically optimized for low template DNA samples like those found in cartridge casings. Additionally, the development of probabilistic genotyping software has greatly improved the ability to interpret complex, low-level, and mixed DNA profiles, enabling for more meaningful analysis of the challenging samples often recovered from spent cartridge casings. New collection devices and extraction protocols have been specifically designed to maximize DNA recovery from the challenging metal surfaces of cartridge casings. These are some of the key improvements. Using a combination of different swab types and rinse solution to more effectively collect trace DNA from the casing surface. Incorporating abilities in the rinse solution that reduce the degradative effects of copper on DNA. And lastly, employing techniques like soaking and sonication to dislodge more cellular material from the metal. In San Diego PD, study of 96% of samples had the loader's DNA, while 40% of the samples were mixtures. By utilizing soaking techniques for DNA recovery, forensic lab technicians were able to produce interpretable DNA results for 35% of the overall samples. One cause of poor DNA recovery from fired casing tests is improper handling, packaging, and transport of the casings. Given these results, some manufacturers have redesigned casing packaging and transport to avoid the problem. For example, the patented case grabber tool for crime scene investigators ensures safe collection, packaging, and transport of fired casings in a unique way. The casing is retained and collected from the inside by a specially designed stainless steel spring tweezer, after which a clear plastic container in the shape of a tube is snapped on the device handle, protecting the casing surface from contact. The casing is securely retained and the tool with the protected casings is transported safely to the lab. Once ready for processing, the protective tube can be removed and the casing can then be swabbed. While the potential benefits are clear, there are several challenges and considerations to keep in mind when swabbing fire cartridge casings for DNA. Several of the best practices should be followed. Prompt collection. Cartridge casings should be collected as soon as possible after the shooting incident to minimize environmental degradation of any DNA present. Proper handling and packaging, and effective swabbing. It's a really interesting advancement. I found it at the Forensic Magazine page. You can find it as forensicmag.com, and I really think this is really interesting, and I can definitely see the benefits. The casing is better protected, and well, we're obviously seeing that forensic investigators are improving the techniques to collect and process DNA on these bullet casings. It really is an important advancement in the case of homicide or even an attempted murder. Moving on to the morgue files. For today's case, it concerns about a serial predator known as Mr. Cruel. An unknown man known as Mr. Cruel, who committed several horrific crimes would terrorize Melbourne, Australia, in the late 1980s. He is responsible for the abduction and sexual assault of 3 girls between the ages of 10 and 13 and the murder of a 13-year-old girl in 1991. He committed his crimes wearing a black ski mask, meaning none of the victims could provide an identifiable description of his face. Law enforcement only likeness to Mr. Cruel is a terrifying police sketch depicting his mask. For the police investigation section, we know that authorities invested nearly $4 million in the investigation to catch Mr. Cruel. Up to 40 investigators interviewed 27,000 suspects, checked 30,000 homes, and arrested more than 70 people. But to this day, we have not been able to identify the perpetrator. The crimes. From 1988 to 1991, Mr. Cruel terrorized the quiet suburban areas of Melbourne. On multiple occasions, he took victims from their homes to an unknown location where he sexually assaulted them before dropping them off in other suburban areas to be found and returned to their families. The perpetrator is known as Mr. Cruel because of the meticulous planning of his attacks and his tendency to trick parents of victims by pretending his only motive was to rob them before kidnapping their children. He also planted red herrings at crime scenes to the investigators. To this day, Mr. Cruel remains unidentified. This overview will first look at the 4 cases that are considered canonical for the Mr. Cruel attacks, which it seems more detectives agree were the work of Mr. Cruel. Let's now move to the timeline of the crimes. The canonical attacks. The first case of the canonical Mr. Cruel attacks was that which occurred on August 22nd, 1987, in Lower Plenty. In this case, the perpetrator, wearing an open-face balaclava and armed with a handgun, a knife, and carrying a rape kit, broke into a house at an unknown address and tied up the parents in the household, as well as the 6 to 7-year-old, before raping the 11 or 12-year-old daughter over a period of 2 hours. The location of this house has never been revealed publicly, nor has they identified. The second canonical attack occurred in the early hours of December 27, 1988. This time, the attack occurred in the home of the Willis family. The perpetrator broke into the house and tied up the parents before abducting a 10-year-old girl, Sharon Willis, from her bedroom and taking her to a waiting vehicle. He drove Sharon to his lair at an unidentified location where she was. He then dumped her 18 hours later at Bayswater High School. The third of the canonical attacks occurred on July 3, 1990, when Mr. Cruel broke into the expensive rented home of the Linus family. This time, the parents were not home, but Nicola Linus, who was 13 at the time, and her sister Fiona, who was 15, were sleeping in their bedrooms. Mr. Cruel woke them up before tying Fiona to her bed and abducting Nicola. He took the family's rented car keys and stole their car before driving Nicola to Chaucer Avenue, just a few streets away, from where he bundled Nicola into his own car and drove her back to his lair. Here, he assaulted her and held her captive for a period of 50 hours, dumping her in the early hours of her 14th birthday. Lastly, the fourth of the canonical attacks. This time the attack occurred on April 13, 1991, in the wealthy suburb of Templestowe, where Carmine Can and her two sisters, Carly and Karen, were at home watching television. A masked man broke into the house before bundling Carly and Karen into a wardrobe and pushed a bed up against it to block their exit. He then abducted Carmine, and she was never seen alive. There are many other incidents also linked to Mr. Cruel. However, I could not find the timelines of those incidents. There are some on the internet, but I decided these four are the ones that describe the way he would operate and kind of his meticulously planned plans for abducting these children. Moving away from the timeline of his story, I also found this information is from the truecrime-database.com, and it reads, "The Psychology of Mr. Cruel." This information has long kept secret because it was the belief of the investigators that if it became public knowledge, the offender might dispose of what would become vital evidence. Australian media outlets began reporting in December 2010 that Victoria Police had reopened their investigation into the Mr. Cruel case. During a review of their original inquiry, known as Operation Spectrum, detectives launched a covert operation in April 2010. It was called Task Force Apollo, which was a dedicated investigation tasked with capturing the suspect known as Mr. Cruel. Leading this new investigation was Superintendent Doug Fryer, who said that substantial new intelligence had been warranted. The establishment of a new task force to explore what he described as every avenue of inquiry. Sifting through a huge stockpile of evidence, Apollo investigators would spend 6 months reviewing hundreds of thousands of pages gathered by Spectrum, which amounted to more than 12,000 pieces of information that needed to be reviewed and cross-referenced with new details as part of the investigation. Much to the shock of the task force personnel, it soon became apparent that the stored Spectrum case files were a complete mess. They had been kept mostly unorganized, and many relevant pieces of information had been misfiled. They began the laborious tasks of transferring them into an electronic format, but worse was to come. Superintendent Fryer admitted that some of the evidence retrieved from the crime scenes at the time had gone missing. One missing item was the tape used to bind one of the victims, which could have provided DNA samples of Mr. Cruel by using new forensic technologies. Task Force Apollo investigators had hoped that this key piece of evidence could possibly lead to DNA evidence, but it was now missing from police custody. The fact that important evidence had vanished presented a new inquiry, with the very real possibility that Mr. Cruel had been an active member of law enforcement. And many within the investigation had to contend with the knowledge that the rapist and suspected murderer might have been under their noses their entire time. Colin McLaren, a retired detective who had been a senior investigator in the original Operation Spectrum Task Force investigation into Mr. Cruel, said that the case was the one that still lingered some 2 decades later. And I quote, "I probably don't know of any other more important case that I've worked on that is still unsolved," he said. "This strikes me at the heart of the most parents, if not everybody in the community." Despite the shortcomings of Operation Spectrum, the newly formed task force had learned many important details from the first investigation. At the time of the original operation was disbanded, There were 32 suspects who could not be eliminated from inquiries. It was also revealed that Mr. Cruel had much more complicated pattern of offending that was previously known. He also worked at Camberwell Grammar School, where he taught first aid courses. Knight was initially suspected of abducting and murdering missing schoolgirl City Yacorn Seaborn. The 13-year-old went missing on June 2nd, 2011. However, police have never ruled out any involvement. To this day, Task Force Puma is still actively investigating her abduction. On June 23rd, 2013, 62-year-old Knight fell to his death in an apparent suicide, whilst inside the Melbourne Remand Center. Just hours before he was incurred to face charges of possessing almost 10,000 child porn images. Sergeant O'Connor told the Herald Sun, Given what we know about the man, it is probable that future crimes have been prevented by his death. That wraps it up for this episode's case of Mr. Cruel. If you ask me, it was undoubtedly a disturbing scenario for these families. As far as I know, it could have been over 10 or 12 cases, although we only covered 4 of them. It's pretty impressive to think that there is people like him out there. With nothing more to say, I wish everyone a good night. Thank you.